Chapter 10 Mr. Cruel. Founded in 1835, Melbourne, in southeastern Australia, is known for being a very active city, with constantly changing weather. The Union Lane area is filled with vibrant, world-famous street art. On the quiet outskirts of Melbourne, you can find the suburban area called Lower Plenty. In the 1980s, Melbourne had a reputation for having some crime, but overall it was considered very safe compared to many other places around the world. That's why it came as such a shock when a real-life evil villain began his crime spree on a cool morning in 1987. On the 22nd of August, during the early Saturday morning hours of 4 a.m., a masked intruder broke into a peaceful family home by removing one of the window panes in the living room window. The man entered the house unnoticed and headed upstairs to the parents' bedroom, armed with a knife and a handgun. When he woke the parents, he threatened to take lethal action if they attempted to call for help. Here, he decided to prevent their chances of escape by ordering them to lie on their stomachs face down. He tied both their hands and feet while pretending to be a common thief who was only after their valuables. The knot used to tie the parents up was a significant detail, as it was similar to one used by experienced sailors. The intruder then completely nullified their chances of escape by blindfolding the couple and gagging them with surgical tape, forcing them into a nearby wardrobe and locking them inside. He also made his way across the hall to the room of a 6-year-old boy and blindfolded him, gagged him, and tied him to his bed as well. Next, the man entered the room of the 11-year-old daughter. For almost 2 hours, the girl was put through agony and sexual perversion, interrupted by a period where the man stopped to make himself a meal, before continuing his sexual assault. The intruder left the house with a blue jacket belonging to someone in the family and a box of records. The names of the family members were never released, but since that morning, the mysterious criminal has been known as an Australian boogeyman of sorts, appropriately named Mr. Cruel. There were exactly 0 similar reports prior to the event on the 22nd of August. Yet, unknown to the police and the citizens of Melbourne, this was only the beginning. It quickly became apparent that the attack was unprovoked, and the investigators couldn't find anything to connect a perpetrator to the family. As police began their investigation, they realised that because the parents and son were blindfolded, bound and gagged, they wouldn't be able to provide much helpful information. The family members were only able to describe the intruder as a man wearing dark clothing and a balaclava, which is a form of cloth headgear similar to a ski mask. On the other hand, the daughter recalled that during one of the man's breaks, he allegedly used the family telephone to make a call. To her, the call sounded like a threat because she heard the perpetrator tell the person on the line, who he frequently referred to as a bozo, that they should move their children or they would be next. Phone records, however, could never confirm that call. Police only later learned that Mr. Cruel often used similar tactics to confuse the investigators and throw them off his trail by placing fake calls and planting fake evidence. More than a year later, on what should have been a blissful post-Christmas evening, on the 27th of December 1988, another family was tormented and experienced an attack that would leave them traumatized and haunted for the rest of their lives. A few miles southeast of Lower Plenty, where the first attack occurred, the second incident unfolded in the Ringwood suburb home of John Wills, his wife, and their 4 daughters. John was jolted awake at 5:45 a.m. by a man in dark blue overalls wearing a ski mask and pressing something against his temple. The intruder threatened John with a handgun and told him not to be a hero, while he pointed the knife in his other hand at John's wife. Much like the first crime, the two were forced to roll onto their stomachs, where their hands and feet were bound with copper wire. The wire was knotted into a similar sailor's knot as before, and the parents were also blindfolded and gagged with the same type of surgical tape used in the initial attack. Assuring the couple that he was only there for the money, the man stole about $35 from the bedside table drawer. Following this, the perpetrator moved through the house and systematically cut the phone lines. Next, Mr. Cruel entered the room that the 4 girls were sharing and woke the eldest daughter by calling to her by name. Sharon Wills, 10 years old at the time, was then blindfolded and gagged. Mr. Cruel collected some of her clothes and placed them in a bag, and then left with her in his arms. Once the parents could work themselves free, about 15 minutes later, their worlds fell apart when they realised that Sharon had been abducted. John had to use the neighbour's phone to alert authorities since their own phone lines were cut, and he then began frantically searching the neighbourhood for any trace of his eldest daughter. In a strange twist of events, roughly 18 hours later, John and his family were notified by authorities that they'd received a call from an unnamed woman who phoned the police to advise them that she'd found a small child on a street corner dressed in green garbage bags who referred to herself as Sharon Wills. Sharon was soon reunited with her family. Upon questioning, Sharon shockingly described the perpetrator as gentle, despite sexually assaulting her, and said that it was as if he really cared about her, his victim. She couldn't give a physical description of her kidnapper due to being blindfolded, but she mentioned that he seemed to be soft-spoken. The police found the report to be in stark contrast to the man's actions and made sure to take a note of this. Sharon also told the investigators that while in confinement, the man gave her milk and lemonade while feeding her a Vegemite sandwich. Close to the time he decided to let her go, he washed her body, removing any forensic evidence that could link him to the crime. Mr. Cruel also went so far as to clip her fingernails and toenails and brush and floss her teeth. It can be assumed that the perpetrator then dressed her in green garbage bags because he didn't want any evidence from her original clothes to be linked to him either. He dropped her at a high school not too far from her house. The traumatic event resulted in many months of the Wills family refusing to sleep in separate rooms and spending their nights sleeping together in the living room. They also installed a security system and took in a guard dog as well. And while the police were determined to find the assailant, the case was at a dead end because they couldn't find sufficient or any evidence that would lead to a single suspect. During one of Sharon's later police questionings, she provided a new piece of information when she recalled hearing a low-flying aircraft during her brief capture. Meanwhile, Mr. Cruel was succeeding in what every villain dreams of. He was spreading fear, and he left people in the area asking themselves, who would be next? Travelling south of Lower Plenty and west of Ringwood, on the outskirts of Melbourne, is the suburban town of Canterbury, Victoria. Closer to the centre of Melbourne proper, this prestigious area was known to house many Australian politicians and public officials, particularly on Monomeath Avenue, where the Linus family rented a home. They were a relatively well-off English family that had temporarily relocated to Australia for business reasons, and while in Australia, they believed they had selected a safe neighbourhood in which to raise their children. Only days before they planned to return to their England home, Brian and Rosemary's world was turned upside down on the 3rd of July 1990, when they left their 2 teenage daughters at home to attend a farewell party. The 2 girls, 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola, were awakened sometime around midnight by an angry intruder armed with a gun and a knife. The masked man tied Fiona to the bed she'd been sleeping in, while he ordered Nicola to go fetch her Presbyterian Ladies' College school uniform from the other room. The incident was quick, as the 2 lone teenagers stood no chance to either fight or flee. After Mr. Cruel informed Fiona that her father had to pay a $25,000 ransom fee for Nicola's release, he grabbed Nicola and took off with her in the family's rental car. The abductor drove for a few miles from the house, where he had a planned parked getaway vehicle and ditched the family's rental car. Roughly 20 minutes after the kidnapping, Brian and Rosemary returned home to find their vehicle was missing and their front door wide open. They found Fiona bound to her bed and Nicola was missing. Fiona told them what had happened and delivered the ransom message. Unlike Sharon Wills, Nicola was not dropped on a street corner later that day or even the next. Mr. Cruel's tactical abduction left no evidence for the police to find, and they were being pushed for answers. They started to think Nicola's abduction was related to Brian's business dealings. After 36 hours, Brian decided to hold a press conference where he pleaded with the perpetrator and agreed to meet his demands for Nicola's safe return. However, there were no arrangements for how Mr. Cruel would receive the money. Amazingly, on her 14th birthday, Nicola was found alive. It had been 55 hours after she was taken from her bedroom. Nicola Linus was left outside of an electrical utility station in Kew, which was not too far from her house, and was told to lay face down on her stomach until her captor drove off. She was fully dressed and wrapped in a blanket. Once the man drove off, she removed her blindfold and walked to a nearby house. Brian received a call at about 2 a.m. and gave a sigh of relief when it was his daughter at the other end. During questioning, Nicola revealed that Mr. Cruel had reddish-brown hair and was about 5 foot 8 inches tall, noting that he was barely taller than her. Nicola was able to provide another significant piece of information, a description of the assailant's house and his car. Although the sketches she provided were plain and held no considerable detail, the investigators were intrigued by hearing that Nicola had taken a few chances of peeking out from her blindfold before Mr. Cruel threatened her by saying, "My freedom is worth more than your life." During captivity, she was forced to wear a neck brace that was attached to the perpetrator's bed. She recalled hearing the man talk aloud to another person, but there was no response that followed. Investigators were unsure whether the crime thus involved an accomplice or whether he was planting false evidence again. In another incredibly similar connection to Sharon Will's case, the abductor bathed Nicola before letting her go. A few months after the Linus family moved back to England, Nicola remembered another piece of evidence. She reported that she recalled hearing a low-flying aircraft near the abductor's house. This led investigators to suspect that Mr. Cruel lived near the Tullamarine airport. With all the mounting evidence, police still didn't even have a suspect, and the nightmare only continued. In the Templestowe district of Victoria, another family home was hit on the 13th of April 1991. Both hard-working Australian immigrants, John and Phyllis Chan, parents of 3 daughters, ran 3 Eltham area restaurants and often got home after midnight due to working more than 18 hours a day. They frequently left their girls at home alone, with the eldest daughter, 13-year-old Carmine, to take care of her younger siblings. Detectives believed that Mr. Cruel would track the lives of his intended victims for weeks, perhaps months, to learn about their habits. Therefore, it came as no surprise that he invaded the Chan home on a Saturday evening when he knew John and Phyllis would be busy at one of their restaurants. The girls were planning to spend their evening the way Saturday evenings usually went, watching movies in Carmine's room. Sometime around 8:40 p.m, Carmine and one of her younger sisters went to the kitchen to prepare dinner when they were surprised by an intruder. The man was holding a knife and wore a balaclava and a green and grey tracksuit. He forced the 2 youngest girls into Carmine's closet, pinning it shut by moving a bed in front of it. He then told Carmine to take him to the family safe, convincing her he was only there for the money. But Mr. Cruel took off with Carmine instead. After a few minutes, the sisters were able to break out of the closet and immediately phoned their parents' restaurant. When the authorities arrived after the crime was reported, they found the words, "Payback, Asian drug dealer, more to come," painted in bold letters on the mother's car parked in the driveway. The police were confident the attack was planned, based on the painted note left on the car, and because the yard didn't show obvious signs of children living there. The perpetrator had cut through a window screen to get in and exited through the kitchen's glass sliding doors. Police tracking dogs were able to trace his steps through the family's garden and tennis court to an abandoned lot 300 yards away from their house, where they lost the scent. A press conference was held 72 hours after the abduction. John and Phyllis also pleaded with the perpetrator for their daughter's safe return. The Chan family also posted an encrypted letter in the local newspaper, one that only Carmine could decipher, in the hopes of offering ransom money for her return. The younger sisters also each wrote a letter to be published, stating that they really wanted their sister to come home safely. Sadly, months passed without any word from Mr. Cruel or Carmine. It's thought that the investigation was mistreated from the beginning when the police failed to establish the Chan house as the scene of a crime. Multiple officers contaminated the house and potentially spoiled any evidence before investigators could inspect it for clues. The words written on the car led the investigators astray, as they spent the majority of the first months looking into the Chan's family business and personal lives, and whether they had any criminal connections. However, realizing that this was probably another tactic in Mr. Cruel's scheme, the focus of the investigation was again moved back to him. The case famously became known as Operation Spectrum, which was a multi-million-dollar venture that involved thousands of volunteers and a $300,000 reward for anyone with valuable information. A year later, the case took a turn for the worst. On the 9th of April 1992, fully decomposed skeletal remains were found near Thomastown by a man who was taking his dog for a walk along Edgar's Creek. Police were called, and the remains were reported as belonging to the missing Carmine Chan. The cause of death was revealed to be 3 gunshots to the back of her head, and the decomposition indicated that she was most likely killed shortly after being taken. While there were many theories as to why Mr. Cruel decided to murder Carmine, her own mother, Phyllis Chan, remained convinced that her stubborn and clever daughter most likely found out the identity of her abductor, fought back, and paid the price thereof. Operation Spectrum was officially connected to the 3 previous attacks and rape cases, placing the sole focus on Mr. Cruel, also known as the Hampton Rapist. The team consisted of 40 members who investigated over 27,000 suspects, received over 10,000 tips called in by the public, and searched through 30,000 houses. The case lasted for another few years and cost over $4 million. Many theories surfaced regarding the mystery of Mr. Cruel. His identity was never established, but as a result of the investigation, the task force was able to arrest over 70 individuals who were found guilty of child pornography. It was believed that Mr. Cruel was involved in child porn trading because the 2 abductees who escaped his captivity allegedly commented that they saw and heard a camera in the room they were held in. The girls also revealed that their abductor fantasized that he was married to them. An additional theory suggested that Mr. Cruel had ties with the Victoria school system, possibly even employed by them, based on some details he knew, like Sharon Will's name. The assaults and kidnappings all took place during school break, and Nicola Linus and Carmine Chan both attended Presbyterian Ladies' College. It would be no surprise that this monster spent his working hours among children and walked the halls stalking his next victim. Another theory was that Mr. Cruel had experience with law enforcement, as he leveraged tactical planning and forensic knowledge to avoid being caught. The fact that he cleansed his victims and stripped them of any traces that could lead to his identity is convincing enough that he would have known what investigators would look for. While Operation Spectrum delivered a lot of great results, the Victoria Police were suspected of corruption and cover-ups in the early 1990s. These claims gravely affected the investigation into Mr. Cruel, and unfortunately, Operation Spectrum and any potential leads were shelved in 1994. Almost 20 years after the first attack, the Apollo Task Force was launched in 2010 in the hopes that new scientific technology and investigative knowledge could put the case to rest once and for all. However, they faced a challenge when they found that most of the case files were unorganized, misfiled, or missing altogether. Evidence was also found to be missing. One piece of significant DNA evidence that could have connected Mr. Cruel to the cases and led to a major breakthrough was the piece of surgical tape used to bind one of the victims. It remains unclear whether the misplaced evidence was due to outright corruption or simple negligence. In 2013, authorities finally made an arrest that could ultimately have been the Hampton Rapist, Robert Keith Knight, a youth worker and school volunteer who'd previously been arrested for various crimes against children. His 2 most prominent charges were in 1980 and 1996, for sexual assault against minors. Allegedly, Knight was one of the lead suspects under Operation Spectrum, but they never had enough evidence to arrest him. However, he was never removed from their suspect list, and, when one considers his timeline, the Mr. Cruel assaults line up with the time he would have been released from his 1980 conviction. When Knight was released from his 1996 conviction, he started accumulating thousands of child pornography photographs and quickly drew the attention of the Victoria Police. While awaiting his trial, he pled guilty and committed suicide by jumping from a second-story prison railing. Unfortunately, the Mr. Cruel case still remains open and unresolved, although there hasn't been another case linked to him since Carmine Chan's murder. Recent theories involve his participation in the 2011 abduction of Bung Siraboon, who was a 13-year-old schoolgirl at the time. In March 2022, a new theory surfaced based on the use of new software technology used to link evidence. Investigators are now considering whether Mr. Cruel worked in the electrical industry since he released his victims in close proximity to electrical substations around Melbourne. The data acknowledges that the locations are all within 20 minutes of each other and that the perpetrator must have been comfortable around those areas. Mr. Cruel is still one of Australia's most wanted criminals. Investigators acknowledge that it's possible that Mr. Cruel is no longer alive or has moved his criminal behaviour to another area. Meanwhile, there continue to be exciting advancements with respect to DNA technology, which was first used in 1953. Researchers at the University of Texas in Dallas are investigating nanopore technology to speed up DNA testing. Their ultimate goal is to be able to develop handheld DNA test kits to enable more economical but accurate DNA testing. All new advances in technology help investigations by saving time and money, by providing better methods of collecting and correlating data. Artificial intelligence methods can be applied to vast quantities of data to gain insights that might otherwise be impossible. Perhaps one day this mystery will be solved.